This is our 21st lesson on the biblical flood. This is a pretty thorough study on the subject, and it deals with my book, the Biblical Flood, entitled The Biblical Flood. The second edition, we're dealing with the second edition of the book, which hasn't been printed yet. Those in the class have a copy, and I keep updating it as I go through, adding things to it. Hopefully, sometime this year, I'll be able to get it out. This is the year 2021. And we're looking at the probable mechanism used to bring about the flood. Now, be aware of this. We go back to our first lesson or two in how we're going to determine something to be true. And of course, we begin with the Bible. And I begin with it as the infallible Word of God. Then from that, I look at science, and we dealt with the different degrees of certainty of things we know. So we're going to drive a stake in the ground for what the Bible says, and then we'll use science in accordance with the Bible, not to contradict it, of course. Well, obviously, the scriptures teach that God brought about a flood. That's certainly clear. And so we know that happened. The scriptures tell us. So, but how did God bring about the flood? How was it accomplished? What mechanism did he use? Now, God has within his repertoire what we call providential means. That would be working through natural laws, or he could even work through spiritual laws. Okay. So working through natural laws primarily here is what we're looking at. And he could have miraculous. He could do things by miracles. So these are the two ways generally accepted by those who study the Bible pretty thoroughly as the ways that God could operate and has operated in the past and still operates today, certainly providentially. And so what we have here is we have these two methods, these two things. Or it could be a combination of those. And some have postulated or theorized that he used providential and miraculous combination in the flood, and both combined. So what we have to determine is some hermeneutical rules as to when providence and miraculous would be determined, when we determine it was one or the other, and look at rules of logic as well, logical principles. Let's look at Genesis 6:17. And I, behold, I do bring the flood of waters upon the earth. So God said he's bringing it. So God brought the flood of waters to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life. Now, we've been through this already. And so this didn't include fish and other things, although many fish died in the flood. But he did not wipe out all the fish. Wherein is the breath of life, from under heaven, everything that is in the earth shall die. And this might be on the earth, but in the earth probably indicates things on dry land, the earth being dry land. While this passage clearly sets forth that God brought the flood upon the earth, it certainly does, it does not give the mechanism by which he brought it about. So we have to look to the rest of the Bible as to his mechanism. We know God brought it. The scriptures plainly tell us right here and other places that he did. So, but how is still an open question. We have to look at other verses, other passages. What we need to do is synthesize, and this is from two Greek words, from the word for thesis and soon. And so this is to place together or arrange things together, put all the facts together, all the information together, and then draw a conclusion from it. That's what that means. So we need to synthesize the information from the scriptures and the laws of nature and the physical evidence into a reasonable explanation of how God brought about the flood. All three of these need to be put into place. So we're going to look first at the scriptures, and no interpretation is allowed that would violate the scriptures, contradict them, because they're infallible. The laws of nature, so we look at laws of nature, generally laws of physics, chemistry, and so forth. And then we look at the physical evidence. What do we see out there in the rocks and in the strata and so forth, fossils and things of that nature, and put all of these together into a reasonable explanation. So in that order, too, I believe, start with the scriptures, what we know as laws of nature, not theories, but laws, and then the physical evidence that we see up there. Christians should be willing to discard their ideas and logically examine the scriptures, the laws of nature, and the physical evidence. And again, we start with the scriptures, and it has to conform to the scriptures first. That's the first rule. And nothing will be allowed that doesn't conform with the scriptures, in my interpretation. At least two factors are set forth in the scriptures. Number one, the breaking up of the fountains of the deep in Genesis 7, 11, 12. And second, we have the rainfall, which was 40 days in Genesis 7, 11 through 12. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were open, and the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So right here we have the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven. Some interpret that to be the rain. We'll show later that it's not. And the rain is separate here, 40 days, 40 nights. But again, there's a misunderstanding about the windows of heaven. So we'll come back to that later. So kind of flag that in your mind, and we'll show that it's different. And that the windows of heaven lasted 150 days, and the rain lasted 40 days. So, and there's two different Hebrew words that are used for rain as well. God brought the flood, Genesis 17, but how? Was it miraculous? Was it providential? That is through natural laws, or was it a combination of miraculous and providential? Which was it? Again, that's our question. Let's go back to our passage. And I, behold, I do bring the flood of waters from the earth. It doesn't tell how he did it. It does not say I miraculously brought the flood of waters. Neither does it say I providentially brought the flood of waters. But it said God brought it. Now, we know God operated in miraculous ways and providential ways both. Maybe other ways, but I don't find scripture for any other way. So I'm open to that if someone could show me from scripture that there's another possibility. So I've come down to two possibilities here, miraculous or providential. That's my thinking on it. Now, again, I'm open to anybody showing me that there's a third possibility. Of course, a combination of both of them would be a third option here, but it's still using those two ways, miraculous and providential, just combining them. And so again, it doesn't tell us. And it doesn't tell us how he did it. It just says he did it. So we don't need to be assuming stuff until we look at the evidence. 150 days breaking of the fountains of the deep in Genesis 7, 11, 12. And there were 40 days of rainfall in Genesis 7, 11 to 12, which we've already looked at. There were, in Genesis 7, 11 and 8, 12, there were 150 days of the windows of heaven, 150 days of that. So many Bible believers think that the 40 days of rain was the only cause of the flood. Now, you notice that I use the word think instead of believe, because I think believe is based on evidence. And faith is based on evidence. Belief and faith are from the same root word in the Greek. And so I would not say they believe this because there's no evidence to support that. And so we have other evidence from the scriptures. And so the 4 days of rain was involved in the flood, but it was, I believe, a minor part of it. With the present physical conditions, there cannot be a worldwide rain which would cause the universal flood covering the mountains. So you'd have to have a lot of water up in the sky to cover the mountains up. Then if you rained all over the earth and covered the mountains, where would the water go? Where would it go? That's another problem. And the atheists bring that up. And of course, a person that's stuck in the idea that the 40 days of rain caused the flood, he's kind of trapped. And they're trapped into a problem of explaining it. It just doesn't make sense. And of course, then the atheist makes fun of it. Right? So where did all the water go if the rain was the only cause of the flood? That rain come out of the sky and came down on the earth. Where did it go? And the atheists ask that question. I'll give you some links where they ask it. Or some say, well, the rain was caused by a miracle. Well, that's a possibility. It's logically possible. And of course, is it, according to the scriptures, is the question, according to evidence. The rain was caused by physical conditions not present today. That's a possibility too. And so what we have to ask is, what caused that 40 days of rain? The rainfall, again, in my position is it was only a minor part of the flood, and the breaking up of the fountains of the deep was a major factor causing the flood. That's my contention. That's the hypothesis I'm setting forth. The evidence. In John 16, verses 12 through 14, let's look at the purposes of miracles, because we have some that claim that the flood was caused by providence and miracles together. And Whitcomb and Morris, very famous men on this, take this position. I think John Whitcomb is primarily the one that does. The revelation of the will of God in John 16, verses 12 through 14, one of the purposes of miracles was to reveal God's will. God miraculously guided men to write the scriptures. He guided men and some women to speak his will as well. So we do have some women prophetesses, but primarily it was mostly men. But he guided these people to infallibly write his will and or speak it. Combination, either spoken or written. So the revelation of God's will was one of the purposes of miracles. And I believe that this Bible was inspired and written by inspiration of God, and that was miraculous guidance of men who wrote the Bible. And so that's one purpose of miracles. A second purpose of miracles in Mark 16:20 and other passages, Hebrews 2 and verse 1 through 4, was to confirm that what had been written was actually written by a true prophet, a spokesman for God. And a prophet is just a spokesman for God. The prophet of God is. And so God put a seal or a confirmation upon these prophets to establish that they're his prophets. They're his people, his spokesmen. Incarnation of Jesus, I believe, was by a miracle. And I would say Isaiah 7:14. So we see three purposes of miracles so far. And I would argue then the incarnation was caused by miraculous activity. The creation of heaven and earth probably was a miracle. I take it to be a miracle. God could have worked through some natural laws of some sort that we don't understand. But to me, it seems to be a miracle. I would argue it's almost certainly a miracle. Creation of heaven and earth and all living things was by some miraculous means. We don't see it happening in the physical realm, these things happening. So that's one of the characteristics of a miracle. It can't happen in the physical realm. There's a fifth purpose, and that's the canonization and dissemination of the scriptures. So we have canonization and dissemination. That would be the fifth and sixth. I believe that the Holy Spirit guided men and or women in the first century, and probably in the Old Testament as well. See evidence of it in the first century to establish that certain books and writings were actually scripture. And I laid this out in my book on the work of the Holy Spirit, volume 2. And then, of course, dissemination, I believe there were inspired scribes who copied the scriptures with 100% accuracy in the first century until the end of Age of Miracles. And toward the end of the first century, God brought an end to miraculous guidance of men. Once his New Testament was finished and fully confirmed and fully revealed, fully confirmed, and the churches had been told and shown evidence that it was his word, the books that we have, the 27 books we have. And then there were scribes who made infallible copies with no errors in them, and for all the churches. Once that had happened, that's my contention, then miracles ceased. And God ceased to give men the power to work miracles. Now, God will still work a miracle at the resurrection, I believe. But God isn't working miracles through people today because the purposes have ended. They all ended. All these purposes ceased. And without a purpose, God doesn't do it. That's one of my arguments when I've debated Pentecostals. First argument, and is that God has a purpose for miracles. All these purposes ended, and there's no reason for them today to be worked. And of course, they ask about the resurrection. Sure, it was a miracle, but it's going to be worked in the future by God, but he's not put it in the power of man to do that. But we're talking about the miraculous gifts. If you have any questions, be sure to stop me and ask them. And if the flood were not an act of revelation, not an act of confirmation, not an act of inspiration, not an act of creation, and not an act of continuing to reveal or to confirm, to canonize, or to disseminate, then it was not miraculous. So we would say these things would have to have occurred. So it was not an act of revelation. The flood wasn't. It wasn't an act of confirmation. It wasn't an act of inspiration, an act of canonization or revelation. So it was, there's no reason to think it was caused by miraculous means. Now, the flood, I don't believe, was miraculous. I think the argument here, that's my basic argument. Parsimony means that God only does what's necessary to be done. If God's a perfect being, and we go back up here, I'll get those two off, parsimony at the end. God only does what's necessary. And if you only do what's necessary to be done, a perfect being cannot do excessive. He can't go to excess. He only does what's necessary. And so God being perfect, parsimony has to apply to him. Perfect being will never do anything without a purpose. He has purpose for everything he does. He's perfect. And so perfect being will never do anything, including working a miracle, without a purpose. So if he works a miracle, it had a purpose. God is a perfect being, and God will never do anything without a purpose. Therefore, what we see here is God has to have a purpose for everything he does because he's perfect. Now, Marion, I do things and they don't make any sense sometimes. Sometimes they don't even make sense to me. And I do something and I say, well, why did I do that? And because I'm not perfect, I do make mistakes. And you've listened to these tapes, you know I've made mistakes. I just fess up and admit them. Some very important aspects of the flood involved are an outworking of natural laws and processes through the providence as contrasted with the supernatural intervention of God. It's Whitcomb and Morris's book. And so Whitcomb makes that claim. Whitcomb continues in this book, and we'll have the following slide to show it, by claiming certain aspects of the flood were miraculous. Now, he says some were providence, but certain aspects of it were miraculous. Now, here are the aspects that he claims were supernaturalism, and that would be miracles, occurred. 6 areas which supernaturalism is clearly demanded in the doctrine of the flood are, number 1, divinely revealed design of the ark. And I believe that was. God revealed the design of the ark to Noah. I believe he's right in that. Now, the gathering and care of the animals, I would think it's almost certainly miraculous. He sent the animals to the ark that he wanted to go in the ark. And knowing their genetics, he would know which ones would be suited for the post-flood environment. The care of the animals, I'm not sure that was miraculous. I don't see that as necessarily being miraculous. Noah and his sons and his wife and his daughters-in-law, the 8 of them that were on the ark, I would argue that they actually cared for the animals during the period of the 1 year period of the flood, approximately 1 year. So I would not argue, I would not admit that the care of the animals was miraculous. Although that's possible, God could have done that. Some have argued he made some of them hibernate. That's a possibility, and I would not rule that out. So number two, the gathering is probably miraculous. The care, I'm not certain that's miraculous. Right. Number three, the uplift of the ocean waters from beneath. He argues that's miraculous. I'm going to set forth a hypothesis that it's not miraculous. Okay. He deems it to be miraculous. The release of waters from above, I don't deem that to be miraculous either. I believe that to be providential. Formation of our present ocean basins, I believe that was providential as well. The formation of our present continents and mountain ranges, again, I don't believe that was miraculous. I think there's evidence that it was providential. So I would disagree with him on this. Now, he's very famous, and I'm just a nobody. I understand that. But I'm setting forth my arguments on this. Following were miraculous. The divine real design of the ark certainly was. Gathering care of the animals probably was. The care might have been. We can deal with the care. However, there was no evidence that the uplift of the ocean waters from beneath, release of waters from above, the formation of our present ocean basin, the formation of our present continents and mountain ranges, no evidence that these were miraculous. No biblical evidence that they were miraculous. So God here, Whitcomb argues, and rightfully so, God refused to do miraculously what man or natural processes can accomplish through his providential direction. God maintains a definite economy of miracles. That's parsimony. I agree with him. I agree with everything he says right here. I believe he's right. But I'm using that and arguing that this very argument here shows he normally doesn't use miracles. It's not the norm. Miracles are the exception rather than the norm. The norm is providence. Providence is the norm. God operates through the laws that he set in motion. He operates through them. Study would demonstrate that there was no compelling reason to interpret the last four areas as supernatural events. I'm going to show that there's no compelling reason for it. That providential means could explain it very easily. The basic principles of the Bible interpretation, that's called hermeneutics, is that one should not assert an event is miraculous, not assert it's miraculous without compelling evidence. So unless you have evidence, you ought to take it to be providential. That's the rule of hermeneutics. Normally, an event is to be understood as non-miraculous rather than miraculous because the miraculous is an exception to the general rule. And from parsimony, God only does what's necessary. Now, we ask the question, what compelling evidence can be given for claiming the flood was caused by miraculous events? That's what we have to ask. And again, it's going to take more than one lesson to deal with these points and lay out my model. But we have to look at this and always keep in mind, it could be miraculous, could be providential. The norm is providential. So those who claim it's miraculous, the burden of proof really lies with them because the norm is providential. So the norm is providential. The exception is miracles. Here are some websites. You can go to them. You can do a search in a Google search and find several others. I just take these as some examples of them, of websites that claim the flood didn't occur, and they got arguments. We'll deal with some of their arguments, and most of them, in fact, we'll deal with them. But what we have is we have three different groups here, basically, three different basic arguments. There's two groups that argue against the flood. There are those that claim to believe the Bible, that are liberal, I call them, and they're loose in their interpretation and their views of what happened. I just think they're dead wrong. And they take the view that the earth is very old, billions of years old, accepted the theories of the atheists. And so they take those theories and swallow them. We have what I call old age creationists. They think God created, and he created it by natural means. In other words, the Earth, the universe is 14, 15 billion years old. The Earth's 4.5 billion years old, solar system, and so forth. And evolution, organic microevolution occurred. God just guided it. It's called theistic evolution. We don't have time to deal with all of these, but I believe these are all false. But what we have here is this. These people will argue against a universal flood. And so, by and large, many of these people reject the flood. And there are people that claim to believe the Bible. I think they're just thoroughly misguided in their thinking. The second group is those who are atheists and or agnostics. And these people make arguments against this. Some of these arguments are made on sites that are supposedly websites for teachers, for science teachers in our public schools. And so they've tried to lay out a series of arguments for them. So that's why I have to deal with some of their arguments and try to lay them out and show you the fallacies of their arguments. Because these are arguments that are being fed to science teachers in our public schools in our country. So this is not something unimportant. It's important because of what's going on in our nation. So you have to be aware of that. And of course, the internet's being used by people, teachers all over the world. A lot of people can speak English and they read these arguments. So be aware of that. This is not just an exercise in niceness. This is a deadly battle between us and atheism and unbelievers. And so right here we have to deal with some of these arguments, and we won't go into all of the links and websites, but we'll answer a bunch of their arguments and show how fallacious they are. All right. Now, why did the water not begin to decrease until 110 days after the rain stopped? Let's look at Genesis 8:3. And the water turned off the earth continually, and after the end, notice after the end of 150 days, the waters decreased. When 40 days of rain caused a flood, when it quit raining, the waters would begin to decrease. Now, I know down lower there might be crest of water, flooding water in rivers, they crest. But this is talking about the waters all over the earth, they decreased. So the waters began to decrease after 150 days. 110 days after the rain stopped, because remember it rained 40, so 110 days later would be 150 days, then the waters began to decrease. That doesn't fit the idea that the rain was the sole cause of the flood. Again, it's just not reading the Bible carefully. A very cursory reading of the Bible, just a quick glance at it, and the atheists who make these arguments against it either haven't read it carefully or they're not honest, one or the other. And I think it may be both. I won't accuse them of dishonesty, they're just ignorant, but they surely might be dishonest. And I believe I run into some who were dishonest. Remember, it rained 40 days. And why? Another question here is, why did the ark not float toward the ocean, which would be normal for a vessel under these conditions? Now, if you were in a river, raging currents in a river, your craft is going to be carried downstream with the water. It won't go against the current. Particularly, the ark didn't have a rudder. We don't have any evidence it had a rudder. It certainly didn't have power. Didn't have a propeller to move it upstream. There was nothing to move it upstream against the flow of water. The water running off the continent should have gone downhill. That's normal. And so why didn't the ark float toward the ocean and wind up in the ocean, floating around the ocean? That would be normal. So there's something else. We got to explain it. And that's our problem as Christians. And the ark rested on the seventh month, on the 70th day of the month, on the mountains of Arad. Now, why would it rest on a mountain? Actually, this doesn't say on a mountain. It says the mountains. And this is in the region. Now, I could say in the Rocky Mountains. I went up in the Rocky Mountains and went fishing 30 years ago, fishing for trout on vacation. And so in the Rocky Mountains. Well, does that mean I was on top or inside the Rocky Mountains? No, I was in the realm where the Rocky Mountains are. So this doesn't necessarily mean the ark rested on the top of a mountain, and that's not saying that's what it happened. That's a misconception. It's in the mountains of Ararat. It's in that region where it stopped and rested. Now the problem with that is it shouldn't have been going uphill to stop on a mountain. It should have been moving away from the mountain. Again, the view that's held by some won't explain why this happened. So we have a problem. How do we explain this happening? And so our problem is we've got to explain it. Now right here is Mount Ararat, and this is in the region where it was. As best we can tell, this is about where the ark rested, in this region right in here. All right? This is the country, what we know as Turkey today. This is the country of Turkey. This would be Asia Minor, Asian province of Roman Empire. And over here, over this side right over here is Philippi up in this region where my mouse is going. And this would be Corinth over here. And here's Jerusalem down here below, and here's Syria. So this is what we have here. Let's look at it a little more. These are some pictures of some mountains. This is Mount Ararat. There's actually a couple of mountains there. And there's one of them named Ararat. But it's in that region that we know of. And we have biblical evidence as to where this was and approximately where it was. And so this region is certainly correct. Now, I've got a question. Questions atheists have asked: why are sea creatures buried under and in the sedimentary rocks on the earth? Now, think about this. If we have 40 days of rain causing it, that water is going to run in torrents downhill toward the ocean. How in the world can sea creatures wind up on top of mountains? How can they wind up there? That's a problem. And again, if you take the 40 days of rain cause the flood, you got a problem. There's a serious problem. Many sea creatures cannot swim against the raging currents that would result from a flood. Even strong fish, the raging currents, it tires them out. They have to swim against them. They have to use a lot of energy to swim against it. So how in the world did they wind up in the mountain ranges? I've gone to the mountains up in Rocky Mountains, and I see fossils up high on mountains. And they're there, and you can't deny they're there. It's virtually impossible for mollusks, that's seashells and clams and oysters and things like that, to swim against the currents. Even fish would have a hard time swimming against these currents, tire them out. So how'd they get there? Let's go back now. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on the seventh day, all the fountains of the deep, great deep, broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. So we see when this happened. Now let's skip down to verse 24. And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. They continued and prevailed for 150 days. They began to decrease after 150 days. And so the 40 days of rain had ended 110 days before this. The 40 days of rain was a minor part of it. This is an eye-opener when you study the Bible carefully. When I began to teach this, a local congregation, there was some of the older members thought I was just a heretic, and they really attacked me. I had some grief over it, but I stood my ground because I'm convinced I'm right. But here, I asked them these questions. They said, well, it doesn't really matter. And I said, well, it does to our young people to go off to college and are taught that the flood didn't occur and the Bible's wrong. How are you going to help them? So that's my problem. I run into people that are just ignorant and don't want to hear, don't want to study some more. I want to know more about the Bible. I want to know more about what God said. And I try to dig into it deeply. And I know there's a lot of things I don't understand. The word deep, fountains of the deep sea, deep, almost always refers to the oceans in the scriptures. if you go into do a study on it from both the Hebrew and the Greek, Jonah 2:5 and Luke 8:31, these are passages that talk about it. Waters compassed me about. That's Jonah. Even to the soul, the deep was round about me. That's when he's swallowed up by the sea creature. Okay, the weeds were wrapped about my head. Now, let me point out there's a question here. Did Jonah actually die and God raised him from the dead when he's swallowed by that sea creature, or did he stay alive inside the sea creature and God miraculously kept him alive? That's a question that has to be dealt with, because if he died, then God raised him on the third day, just like he did Jesus. And so there's a possibility there, and there's some implication. He might have actually died. But whatever the case, he was either kept alive by a miracle inside that sea creature, or he died and God raised him. But they were both miracles. There was miracles involved there. But where was he? He was in the deep. He was in the belly of that sea creature, and that God had prepared, and which maybe he might have created one at this point, and they swallowed him up. But it might be something we don't even have today. It might have been just a one-time occurrence. But the word here for whale or sea creature, the Hebrew is not real clear as to what kind of an animal it is. But here he's in the deep. He's in the Mediterranean Sea here. Okay? God brought the waters out of the oceans to cover the land. Now let's read what the text of the Bible actually says. In 2 Peter 3:5, for this they willfully forget, that there were heavens from of old, and an earth compacted out of water and amidst water by the word of God, by which means, listen now, by which means the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. So the water overflowed the land. So that sounds almost like the water come out of the ocean and covered the land. See? So the water overflowed the land, overflowed the earth. God brought the waters out of the oceans to cover the land. That's what I'm contending. Let's look at Isaiah 54:9. Now, we don't just go to Genesis, because the flood is talked about repeatedly in other passages. We need to put those passages into our study as well. So right here in Isaiah 54:9, for this is as the waters of Noah. This is as the waters, just like the waters of Noah, see, unto me. For as I had sworn that the waters of Noah shall no more go over the earth. So I've made an oath. I swore that the waters of Noah would not go over the earth again. How did they go over the earth? They went over the earth. And again, that almost sounds like they come out of the ocean basins. So have I sworn, same thing. I sworn that I will not be wroth with thee, nor rebuke thee. So again, we see that the waters come out of the ocean, overflowed the earth, that they covered the earth, and we see different words being used. Now the psalmist talks about it in Psalm 104, verses 5-9. And he says the mountains were covered, just like we have during the flood in verse 6, as during the flood, Genesis 7:2, and God set a boundary so that the water would not again cover the earth in Psalm 104, verse 9, which is equal to the statement of Genesis 9, verses 12-13, where he promised not to send a flood again. Now let's look at it here. Who laid the foundations of the earth, that it should not be moved forever? Thou coverest it with the deep as with a vesture, and the deep is the ocean sea. The waters stood above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled, and the voice of thy thunder they hasted away. Now, Hebrew parallelism, in this case, would be saying the same thing with different words. Now, that's a form of Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry had parallelism as a characteristic. Now, why would God providentially cause them to have that kind of poetry? Well, I'm looking at it in my own human wisdom. And in my human wisdom, which is fallible, certainly, I agree. But in my own human wisdom, I see it this way. If you translate from the common poem, Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown. Jill came tumbling after. So we have Jack and Jill went up the hill. Jill and hill rhyme, crown and down rhyme. So we have rhyme in our English poetry. But if you translate that into Russian, it won't rhyme. You translate it into Spanish, it doesn't rhyme. Into German, it doesn't rhyme. So the rhyme is lost. So if God brought about, and he did through Tower of Babel, the various languages, and if Hebrew happens to be one of the languages, I think probably Hebrew was the language that Adam and Eve spoke. But I'm not certain about that, but I think there's some evidence that it was. And if that's the case, then God gave them that language. And the poetry, where it's poetic and it's a repetition of the same thing with different words, that's called parallelism. Then in other languages, when this comes out in English, it'll still be, that form of parallelism will still go into other languages. Your other languages can have that same form. In other words, you won't lose the poetic form of it when it's translated. God knew the Old Testament would be translated. That's my human wisdom, and I could be dead wrong. Coverest it with the deep as with a vesture. The waters stood above, and that's the same as covering. And so the deep would be the ocean. See, the waters of the oceans covered it, see. And at that rebuke, they fled. And so the oceans fled away, and they stopped. At the voice of thy thunder, they hasted away. So rebuke and thunder, see. Hasted and fled are the same in verse 7. That's parallelism, I believe, Hebrew parallelism. Look here, in Psalm 108, verses 8 and 9, the mountains rose. This is talking about when the flood occurred, see. When you covered it with the deep, as with the the waters stood above the mountains. When did that occur? That happened in the flood. They fled away. That's the end of the flood. It began to flee away and after 150 days. The mountains rose and the valleys sank down. So the mountains rose during the flood. I believe, and I will show evidence for this, that the mountains had to have been raised during the flood under the place where thou hast founded for them. So God raised the mountains during this time, that thou set a bound that they might not pass over. Well, what's that? That's the boundary. There's not going to be a flood again. That they may not pass over. That they turn not again to cover the earth. And again, there's not going to be a flood again. Go back to Genesis 9:11 and see what he's saying. I will establish my covenant with you, neither shall all flesh be cut off anymore by the waters of the flood. So I set a bound, see, and they'll pass over. And neither shall there be any more be a flood to destroy the earth. I won't cover the earth again with flood. Again, Genesis 9:11 is saying almost the same thing as Psalm 104, verses 8 and 9. So we see the way it's laid out. If the oceans were the primary source of the flood waters, the flood would not decrease until the oceans were stopped from overflowing the earth. So if God somehow made the oceans overflow the land, and he did it providentially, and it could happen, and I believe the evidence is that he did. We'll show it later as we develop this. Then the stopping of the oceans were stopped from overflowing the earth. When that happened, the fountain stopped. Genesis 8:2, we see them stopping. If the water flowed out of the oceans and covered the land, that would scare the sea creatures with it, wouldn't it? And it came in successive overflowings. I believe it was tidal. It would carry the sea creatures over the land, deposit them in layers, strata of rock, if it came in successions. And the model that I'm going to show here would have had many different layers of rock and sediment to be laid. Okay. If water flowed out of the oceans and covered the land, it would not necessarily carry the ark to the oceans and might carry it toward a mountain, depending on how the ocean, currents was moving, which way they were moving, or a range of mountains. So this would explain that. Tides, and I argue that it was tidal in nature. We'll set forth the mechanism for that as we develop this. Rotate, acting like a giant centrifuge at a spinning motion. Now, if you've ever done some work again, as a boy, we used a centrifuge, a cream separator, separate the cream from the whole milk, out of the whole milk, and separated out the cream. And we sold the cream. The whole milk that was left was called Blue John milk. That was the term we used for it. But it was what we called, some called it skim milk. You can skim it off the top of it after you let it set overnight, like in a refrigerator. And you can skim it off, it'll rise to the top. But that's another way you could get the cream out of it. But you could spin it also, and the tides rotate, they spin like a giant centrifuge, which would cause lighter objects to move to the outer portions of the rotating water. The lighter ones would move away and out from it. I watched this as a boy, and I never realized that it was going to help me explain the flood whenever I was young. And so some of my boyhood experiences, I turned one just to rotate it, to separate it out. Because we didn't have electricity. It was powered by Armstrong, okay? And my argument here, the argument of atheists, is if the flood model can explain the physical phenomenon better than the atheistic model, then the flood model is more reasonable. Well, I agree with that. I believe that's right. And that's basically an argument they make. Then they say the flood model cannot explain the physical phenomenon better than the atheistic model. Well, first of all, the argument that they make, the second premise, is fallacious. Why? Because it denies the antecedent. It's logically fallacious. So it doesn't prove it. Doesn't prove their case. Now, the first premise is, I believe, is good. The second premise is debatable as to whether it can or cannot. But the argument, they've denied the antecedent. So they then argue the flood model is not more reasonable, say. So that's their basic argument. And again, it's logically fallacious. Argument of the previous slide contains fallacy denying the antecedent. And again, we get to find out that these atheists are just pretty irrational. They're not very logical. And the problem we have with this is we don't learn how to reason in our schools in the Western world anymore, because John Dewey and his cohorts got it taken out of our educational system. Again, my father was born in 1898, and when he went through the 8th grade, he'd studied logic. Well, you can get a PhD degree now, not even study logic. Very interesting. And again, I've talked about this earlier in this study. And again, we have irrational people. They just don't reason right. This makes the argument be invalid. If it's not valid, it's not sound. It doesn't prove what it purports to prove. It's not constructed by the rules of logic. It's unsound, doesn't prove the conclusion. The conclusion may or may not be true, but it's sure not disproven by this argument. Another argument might prove the conclusion, but this argument doesn't prove it, certainly. It's not logically sound, rational. Let me illustrate this. If Joe is a citizen of Iowa, then Joe is a citizen of the United States. Well, that's certainly true. Why? Because all Iowa citizens are citizens of the United States. Joe is not a citizen of Iowa. Well, I know some Joes who are not citizens of Iowa. I have several friends named Joe who are not citizens of Iowa. And therefore, you say they're not citizens of the United States. Well, that's ludicrous, because the ones I know, I can name several named Joe who are citizens of other states other than Iowa, but are also citizens of the United States. So you see, the conclusion doesn't prove it. Now, is it true if Joe's a citizen of Iowa, then he's a citizen of the United States? That's true. Is it true that Joe, for instance, Joe that I know that lives here in Oklahoma, and maybe I don't think he's ever been to Iowa. I think he told me that one time. I asked him, and he said, no, I've never been to Iowa. But he's not a citizen of Iowa. Well, that's true. But Joe, the Joe I'm talking about, is a citizen of the United States, see? So the conclusion, even though the first and second premises are true, they don't together prove the conclusion because it denies the antecedent. It's bad reasoning. There are thousands of men named Joe. I chose the word Joe because it's a three-letter word, make it easy to get on my slide, who are not citizens of Iowa, but are citizens of the United States. And you probably know some Joes that are other states. I know some Joes. I went to school with a friend named Joe, okay? We chummed around together, and we graduated together. And then I had another friend that was a couple of years younger than me. We chummed around together some. And both of them were named Joe, and they both of them were citizens of other states other than Iowa. I don't know if either one of them have ever been to Iowa. I couldn't say they have or haven't. They may have, but it doesn't matter. They're not citizens of Iowa. I know where both of them live. Both live in Texas now, but they're citizens of Texas. So, and that's a citizen of the United States. Again, the argument doesn't prove it, see? We can show it by this simple argument. First premise, here's a possible atheist argument. If the atheistic model can explain the physical phenomenon better than the flood model, then the atheistic model is more reasonable. Well, that's true. I agree with that. The atheistic model can explain the physical phenomenon better than the flood model. Well, the problem is, his second premise, I deny it, and we're going to show, and we've already laid out stuff that the atheistic model has problems with. We've laid out several points already. We'll show more as we develop this. But and they claim it can explain a physical phenomenon better. Well, they're begging the question there, and they need to proof is in the pudding. They need to prove it. And so they claim the atheistic model is more reasonable. Now, this is a reasonable argument. So the whole thing rests on this second premise. Is the second premise true? I deny it is. Second premise of the Wednesday fallacy are begging the question. They're begging the question. They're assuming what they're trying to prove, and they haven't proven it yet. Second premise of this argument will be disproven repeatedly in this study, and it already has been in some sense. This will prove that argument's unsound. It begs the question. It assumes what the atheist is trying to prove. Let's look here now as we develop this. This is our study, and we are now finished with the 21st lesson here. And this is in chapter 8. Go through now, and I'll lay it out. And